My commitment today on the
Well,
Native
some of those
Edge
skills
is to write more
they're
letters.
needed.
I'm going to write letters to people.
Should.
Just
I didn't realize
it's a surprise. Welcome to the Native Edge podcast. I'm Chris James. I'm here with my host,
Yvette Fielder.
And we are very excited to be with you today. What are we talking about today, Yvette?
Oh, some really awesome, cool things. We have a drum roll, maybe.
A brrr.
Here we go.
Oh, I thought you were
Of
going
our
to tell
guest.
us. Oh, yeah. Well, I was going to. We haven't introduced the guest. Tell us what we're talking about today, though.
Oh my gosh, we're going to talk
We don't even
about
know what we're talking about
advocacy.
today.
We're going to talk about our guest and her
Yes.
awesome resume. And
Yes.
she's packed so many things in her resume
Yes.
over the years. And learn more about all the work that she's done, the incredible work that she's done.
So yes, talking about advocacy today, we're going to talk about some small business stuff. But yes, I want to introduce our fabulous guest. This is someone that I have known for over 15 years, which, I mean, she must have, we both were like in the crib, I guess. But I'm going to introduce our guest today. Clara Pratte is CEO and founder of Strongbow Strategies, LLC. And welcome to Native Edge Podcast, Clara.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited about our conversation because I do want to let people know, all of our audience members, how cool you are. So I'm going to go through some of these things that I found on the LinkedIn.
Okay.
So hopefully they're
it's
accurate.
all accurate. Yeah.
So
You're like, I didn't know I was supposed to update my profile.
Yeah, I didn't go to Wikipedia, but I'm
There's
sure
no
you
wiki.
have. Just some government work. You were at the U.S. Department of Commerce. You were a trade and IT specialist. You must have been 3 years old when you did that. This is where we interacted a lot with the U.S. Small Business Administration. You were director of Office of Native American Affairs. We've talked about that historically with some other episodes. Working with your tribe, the Navajo Nation. You were the legislative affairs of the Washington office, and then you had a second stint as the executive director of that office. And this is really cool. You were the chief of staff of the Navajo Nation Office of the President. That was really cool.
That was fun.
Very
Yeah.
cool. I love this political work, and I call it political work, but you are chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee Native Caucus. Wow. Member at large of the Democratic National Committee. Historic member of the U.S. Presidential Transition Team, President-elect support team of the Office of Nationwide Engagement, and that was President Biden. Wow. Correct.
Correct.
You are correct.
like,
we're good.
yes,
This is
yes,
such a,
I
this
did.
is like a check.
Yes.
Yes, I
like,
did
well, is
this.
it- yeah, that's
I
right,
did
yeah.
that. Tribal Engagement Director for Joe Biden for President. And I'm not finished. This is, we may have to edit some of this out. It's so long. It's like 4 pages. A board membership, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. You are a board member of the World Wildlife Fund, which is awesome. National Museum of the American Indian, board member. Like every one of these, I'm like making sure.
Well, actually, no, not on the museum any longer.
Oh,
yeah.
rotated, but historic. Historically.
Yes.
Yes. White House National Infrastructure Advisory Committee. Wow. And then our relationship with Clara has, as an organization, the National Center for American Indian Enterprise Development, you were a 40 under 40?
I was.
Were you like in the first class of 40 under 40?
I was one of the first 40 under 40s, yeah.
You, again,
The
you were
inaugural
like
class, yeah.
10 years old. That was really way under 40.
That was way under 40.
You were, and then one thing just recently over the past few years, you were our Res TV host at the Reservation Economic Summit, which
That
was
was
so
fun.
awesome.
That was so fun.
Whew. So welcome to the Native Edge.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about some of that work you did. I do want to start with the political work. And just a really simple question, and Yvette, jump in here at any time, but why is it important to really be involved with anything political? And definitely we're bipartisan here, but what gave you that motivation to be, part of campaigns and elections and things like that?
That's a good question. I didn't actually start out thinking I would be political or be involved in advocacy in any way. I started out as a career official with Department of Commerce. And it was during the Bush administration that I joined the Department of Commerce. And so kind of going through that process, and my direct report, who I reported to directly, she was a political. So seeing the transition of power as a career employee when it switched parties, it was really interesting. And I had a stint in Congressman Grijalva's office as a graduate student. So I think that was really the point where I thought, wow, this is amazing. I really want to get involved. And then from there, it just sort of grew into wanting to make sure that particularly tribal and underserved voices were heard in that process. Because I saw in campaigning for, then it was Carrie Edwards, and working through that campaign, it was like, wow, there really isn't a lot of tribal engagement that I'm seeing at that level of government. So just decided to jump feet in at that point and get really involved in making sure that these candidates that were coming and courting various votes, that they were taking tribal voices into consideration, because I just didn't see that happening at that time.
And in the 2000, the last presidential election, 2020-21 election, that was such a critical piece, the Native vote. I mean, that was a huge piece and helped, I think, definitely for Arizona at least, but helped make sure that, the candidate was picked because of the Native vote.
Yeah.
So I like that whole transition of going from, thinking of, because I was also in, thanks to you, by the way, this is something I had told Yvette, that I was going to tell Yvette this story.
Yeah.
So I do have to back up a little bit because just like you, I entered the federal government in 2009, dating ourselves. 2009, I was a career employee, and I was sure that was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. I'm just going to stay. I was at the Treasury Department. I'm going to stay there. And then you and I did an initiative called Growing Economies in Indian Country.
We did.
Which was awesome. It was more like a road show.
It was a road show.
We did.
You're still growing economies in Indian Country.
We are.
Yeah. I mean, I would never have guessed that initiative, that Chris really spearheaded through work at Treasury and then helping through the SBA. It grew into something amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, because when we started, it was just you and me, and maybe I was SBA, Treasury, and Federal Reserve Bank out of San Francisco was the initial group. But, you were the one that when you were exiting to go to, I guess, one of your next adventures, Navajo Nation, right? You were going to work at the Washington office of Navajo Nation. You called me up and you're like, what do you think about being a political at SBA? And I'm like, I don't know.
And I already knew you were like, he was married to being a career person.
Yeah, I was.
Right?
Super.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know, and it was, another election was coming in 2012. This was 2011. And I was like, I don't know. But you helped shepherd me and sort of said, this is what you can do. And you talked to your boss at the time, Karen Mills, who was an amazing administrator. And you advocated for me at President's Personnel Office at the White House. And boom,
you did it.
I became...
Wow, this is like a full
It
circle.
was
Yeah.
such a full circle. Yeah, I became the associate, and you even like made me get a name change.
Yeah,
I was assistant administrator of the Office of Native American Affairs. So amazing how that intertwined and cool to see that journey even back in the day.
Yeah. It was fun. It was fun to be part of that, and then to just see you do all these amazing things. It was just so cool.
Well, to see you do all these amazing things.
But I got to pick, I don't know how many people can pick their successor like that in that environment. And I think it's a real testament to not only the SBA, but the White House and how they were like, well, yeah, if you say this is the person, sure. That was pretty amazing.
So cool, though, because here you are, and you're still building economies and tribal economies in a lot of ways, because that's so important.
One of the things that really resonated with me, and we had talked about this before, some of this work that you do, especially with the Democrat National Committee, a lot of times you're the only Native voice in the room. So talk about that of just, you're constantly educating, I guess, or how does that work sometimes?
Oh, yeah, 100%. And I think, not to date or age myself, but it was interesting when I first started working in government and I'll go back to Grijalva's office, I was sort of shook by how little colleagues on the Hill knew about tribal issues. At that point in time, the congressman was working on a Tohono O'odham citizenship bill, and people were just really flummoxed about the fact that tribal nations, number one, even existed. Number two, were on the border. Number three, had dual citizenship issues. So it's a constant turnover of people in these positions of power. Elections happen, different staffers come on board. They're almost always very, very young, and they don't have a lot of background or experience. And even more seasoned employees within the federal government really didn't understand what a trust and treaty responsibility was, what tribal consultation meant. So just through that advocacy work, it's an eye-opening experience when you realize that people that are in these huge positions of power have very little to no knowledge about tribal sovereignty, tribal issues, tribal policies, how that intersects, with even things like jurisdiction, missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. What does that mean, and how does the federal government play a role in that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you think in your career, when you look back 15, 20 years ago, are you seeing a shift of more of our Native brothers and sisters getting into those positions? Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So 20 years ago, when I started with the Department of Commerce, I was in the International Trade Administration. And I remember at that time asking our administrator, what are we doing to get tribal nations to the table for import-export? And it was just like blank, like, no, what do you mean? What is that? To now, fast forward, there's a tribal liaison for the entire department. Tribal nations are regularly participating in trade missions and trade delegations. That wasn't happening 20 years ago. So that's just one microcosm within the Trade Administration and within Department of Commerce, but you expand that across the federal government. Every single department has some knowledge, or they at least have a tribal liaison type of individual, if not somebody high level, somebody in the secretariat office type of position.
And that was one of the things that was so important at the Small Business Administration, and even back in 2009, you were very adamant that my position reported directly to the administrator. And this is something we have been trying to work on to codify for a long, long time. But, you almost to the point where, like, if this doesn't happen, you probably shouldn't take the job, because this is because you saw it as such a need to have. And I don't know if I really got it until I actually got into that position of how key that was, because it put me, at the table. And historically, the billions of dollars going for 8A, the billions of dollars of access to capital, and if other people are making decisions for our community, or at least making recommendations, it was almost shocking to me that no one turned and say, well, let's ask the Native community, or let's ask. And one of the things you had also spearheaded back for the U.S. Small Business Administration was consultation. And why don't you talk a little bit of your feelings of government-to-government consultation, and why is that important?
Gosh, how much time do we have? So
what would a 101 tribal consultation look like for our listeners who are not familiar with how the federal government works, and what does that mean, and how does it trickle down to them?
Right. So I think when we're dealing with tribal issues, I always separate it out into two different chunks. You've got a government-to-government relationship, and then you also have an individual citizen-to-government relationship. So on the consultation side, that's really the government-to-government relationship piece. And every federal employee, whether they know it or not, has a trust obligation to tribal nations. And a lot of folks within the federal government are not aware of what that means for their just day-to-day job. And we see what happens when tribes are not consulted on various things. We could mention things that, like in the energy space or what have you, where projects get to a certain level and all of a sudden a red flag gets thrown, like, hey, this wasn't consulted on. It stops the progress almost immediately. So, that basic, hey, we've got to work together from the government perspective to inform, engage early on, meaningfully, regularly with tribes. It's not, in my mind, a perfect system by far. I think internationally you see free, prior, and informed consent principles being more of the thing that is the law of the land. We have not caught up in this country with free, prior, and informed consent principles. We're more of the line of, we're consulting with you, right? But if you're in a tribal office, having been on the tribal side, hundreds of emails, letters are coming from agencies and offices all the time. You lose track of what's happening. Have we consulted on this? Did we actually engage? And that's for a very large, sophisticated tribe. So I can imagine smaller tribes are getting inundated with these consultation requests. And those consultations can be anything from a letter saying, well, we've informed you that we've done this and now it's done. Or they could be multilateral types of negotiations that happen over a period of time. And I think with free, prior, and informed consent, it's a little bit more organized in terms of there has to be actual consent. In our world in the United States, there is no consent. It's just consult.
Yeah. And this really, that idea of consultation came from the Clinton administration in the mid-90s, a little bit in the Bush, but then it really hit with in the Obama administration, where it was required to have organized process. And I do see that there was still a little disconnect between the agencies of really not understanding. Now, when I look back, I'm like, oh, well, I'm glad that the groundwork was built for what's happening even now. I think I see more and more of that. But it is a little overwhelming.
It's scary. To me, that is a scary thought that they could just send a letter and say, well, no, you were notified.
Right.
Yeah.
What if it has to do with the land issue? And then next thing you know, like my tribe, they're taking your land through eminent domain and condemning it. Then they turn it into something that they benefit from, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's really scary.
Or a
but
national park situation too, that with theirs, it's not always just the land piece, but it's also the border communities and all of these projects going on. So it is a little daunting when you do have 10 agencies, especially it's new in administration. And both of us were on the transition team for President Biden. You were, of course, in a always a bigger position somewhere. But that I think the whole idea of when a new administration came on board, it was really like we have to consult on everything.
Yes.
And then COVID was also going on. So that was a lot of information. And so from both of your perspectives, how does, if I'm a smaller tribe and I'm trying to pay attention to what's going on in Washington and how that can affect me, and I get 10 or 12 letters of like, oh, so how do I know which is important and which one is, I guess it's tribal to tribal, but what's your thoughts on that? How do I actually balance different ways?
I think tribes can benefit immensely from having good advocacy groups that they work with. Trade associations, things like the National Center to help flag things. Certainly there's a lot of really capable firms out there that do this type of work as well. But they're worth their weight in gold because they can help navigate and save lots of time and bring efficiencies and flagging things that are important.
And I don't think you have to wait, by the way. That was one of the things that I think a lot of times you feel like, well, they haven't really talked about this or they haven't brought it up. It's okay for anybody, if it's a small business owner or if it's an organization or if it's a tribe, if you have a concern or you have an issue or you have an idea, reach out. Everybody can be an advocate.
I think that's really good because to your point of having these positions of tribal people in the different agencies, that's one of their critical roles too, is to help advocate for that community internally. And if there's voices, saying, hey, SBA, we need help on that, that's what that role is there for. And one of the reasons I really advocate that those positions be direct report to like the highest person in that agency is we're not just like any other constituency, because that was what would happen too. They'd say, oh, well, this group, like maybe Latino outreach goes over here. It's like, no, it's not just about a race-based outreach program. There is a higher government-to-government responsibility that we're also needing to engage on that's more than just reaching out to Native American entrepreneurs.
Yeah. And it's a constant re-education.
Yeah.
Because you have a change in Congress and votes every 2 years. So I can only imagine what that looks like. You probably felt a lot of times that you're saying the same thing again over and over.
And the word voting, and I do want to say, I want to go into that because all three of us have heard my vote doesn't matter from people before, and especially in some of our rural areas. They're like, oh, we're sort of the minority or we're the majority or whatever it is, but our voices aren't always heard. Why is it important to vote?
I mean, we look at the last election, the last presidential, it was very, very close in a lot of states, right? That you might think that your vote doesn't matter. Some of these rural areas, they were the most important votes as they were coming in to be counted.
Oh, and it came down to Arizona in a lot of ways, right? And we're like, oh my gosh.
I mean, it's going to be the same.
Looking at us.
Yeah, it's going to be the same this next election, 2024, and I know that there's a lot of apathy out there regarding this election, and I think the worst thing that one can do, no matter what side you're kind of aligned with, is the apathy is going to be the enemy of the good, right? So it's like, if we think about historically from tribal people's perspective, oftentimes we were denied the right to vote at all. We have one of the highest rates of participation in the armed forces. So you think there are people who are very patriotic, but yet still very low voter turnout because of apathy. And I get that people are unhappy with the political parties. I hear it every single day. The way to change it is from the inside out. You can't take a seat out and say, I'm just not going to participate. Get involved, participate, get involved in your local political parties, attend these meetings, because that's the way you do create change. And particularly for our more marginalized communities, like our Native folks, making sure that they have a seat at the table is so important.
And it's okay to run.
Yeah,
for a position.
100%, like run for office.
Run for office.
Volunteer.
Volunteer.
Become a PC, like whatever it is, do that.
Get involved, because it goes all the way back to, if you're not involved, someone else is making the decisions for us.
And we can see some of the folks that are in these positions.
You're like, how did they get there?
What?
Like, when did that happen?
Yeah, don't be scared to do it.
A lot of times, just because they're the loudest voice in the room, it doesn't mean they're right.
Right.
And I think for us to be compliant, that let the one or two people, they're yelling and screaming and making a big deal, but they don't have any substance. Bring people in that do, and support that. Everybody opinions matter, and we all can be an advocate.
Yeah. I agree.
That's my thoughts.
100%. Signing off.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. We're done here.
Moving on. Well, I do want to go into, these boards that you've historically been on. You've been in probably more boards than I mentioned. And I do think it does parallel a little bit with why join national boards? A lot of folks say, hey, yeah, because your boards aren't, of course you're on some Native focused boards, but most of your boards that you're on the national platform. So why is that important?
Well, a lot of times, most of the time, not all the time, you're the only Indigenous voice on those types of boards. And I think a lot of times there's a personal responsibility that I feel if I'm asked or nominated, even though I feel like my plate is full, I'm really hesitant to say no. And if I do say no, I try to put another Indigenous person in there, right? Because there just isn't enough people advocating for these types of things. So for a good example is the World Wildlife Fund, which, they work, we work all over the world with a lot of Indigenous populations in various places in various countries. But until I joined, we didn't have a North American Native person sitting on that board. And it's been really personally fulfilling to work on things like bison reintegration program, right? And I think that being an advocate from that board level to say, yes, this is why it's important and this is how we do it, and to be part of that process has been really, really cool.
And I would imagine also some of the environmental protection piece of that is very important, just for you in general, just because, so how did you find a board like that aligned with your values? And was it that they just reached out to you, or were you actually seeking sort of in your career, looking for maybe areas of how you can support?
Yeah, no, I wasn't looking, and it was actually, it goes back to the networking thing, like people, a friend of a friend, and actually it was somebody that I had worked with, had been asked, and she said, no, my plate's too full, and she had recommended me. So that's how WWF came about. For the Environmental Defense Fund Action Board, that one, I'd worked with the director, David Kiva, on the campaign. So so it's really networking and keeping those networks alive. And then people think, oh yeah, she's doing this or that might align over here, and just kind of keeping those networks fresh.
And I think everybody has networks if they tap into them.
Yes.
And I do believe, and as we've talked, of how, you've supported me in my career, and Yvette's had mentors that have supported her, those circles are so critical to keep up.
Yes.
If you're a business owner, if you're a tribal leader, if you're just just a college student. I mean, Yvette, why don't you talk a little bit about some of your thoughts on the networking? Because she's always talking about it.
I think it's the synergy that's created when you meet someone, especially someone that really inspires you and you really look up to them, and you get to know their story, and then you're networking with them, and then like you mentioned, it's the same thing. They'll tell you about an issue or how you can be involved, and it just grows from there. And so I think the more that you're involved, obviously you're out there, so then you're visible, and it's real tangible. And when you're meeting so many new people, it's really important to engage and really create those pathways, especially for the next generations where they don't have the voice yet, or they're still learning, and to open those doors for them. Mm-hmm. So I've always been actually a really behind the scenes person. Like, I like to get things done, and I haven't always been a person that's been out there in the forefront or anything like what you've done, but I certainly have looked up to people along the way and asked those questions. How did you get here? What are you doing now? Where you wanted to duplicate that in your own life, or for your own children or neighbors in your own community. And that's like what's on my mind right now. Mm-hmm. So,
it was pretty awesome. This is a funny story about Yvette. I mean, she was actually working for 3 affiliated tribes here in the building. She was we were renting that space here. And when within a couple of months, I mean, she would just come over. She was like, hey, I just wanted to, meet you. We had not met historically, and we just had a conversation. And eventually I did have a position that was opening up, and I had one position, and I had like 3 people that I really liked, and Yvette was one of them. So we just created 3 new positions.
Created 3 jobs that didn't have the money for. He's like, by the way, I don't know if you'll be getting paid next week, but.
But I will say, though, from that perspective and that thought of those networks, I mean, you only came into the office to meet me because you had heard about me, and maybe someone had introduced.
I did.
David Beaver introduced us, I guess.
I read about your story.
Yeah.
That you were the new. I subscribed to the newsletter, so subscribe to the National Center newsletter, and I read that you were the new CEO, and I was really impressed with your resume and your background. And I said, I'm going to go down there and introduce myself and meet Chris James, because I didn't know you.
Yeah.
And I was working for my tribe, and they had started talking about creating an office space. And to be truthful, I live in the far East Valley. Let's be honest. And they were talking about not knowing the valley. It's 5 million people and how vast it is here in the valley. And they were talking about somewhere downtown Phoenix. And I envisioned, I know I'm going to be the one starting this office up. And I don't know how long it's going to take them to really take it over and get someone staffed in this position, because I was a consultant to the tribe on different issues. And so I read the story, and I was like, I wonder if they have any office space. Yeah. And I came down, I called and set up a meeting with Chris, and we met. And they did have office space, and so we were
had
able
a lot
to
of
rent.
office space.
You had your pick.
You could have been
And then,
anywhere.
yeah, and with David Beaver,
Yeah.
who is a 8A small business owner, Titan Facilities, who now resides here in our building.
Nashville
He
City.
came in and said, I heard you were renting office space
That's
here.
right.
And I
Yeah.
said, yes. He says, well, I'm all the way in Scottsdale, and, I live really close. And and I'm like, go talk to them. I think this area is open.
Yeah.
And so that's how it
And
kind of
Unity,
happened.
same story.
And again,
Yeah.
the synergy of knowing people,
Yeah.
and who knows who we heard that I was, renting office space for the tribe on behalf of the tribe here.
I think but it again goes back to those networks, and and I don't want to say who you know, because it's not always, because we didn't know each other. It was more of like, it's okay to do what you did. It's okay to reach out to people and say, hey, I'm learning this process, or I'm needing I want to be closer. I want an office closer to my home, or I want to work remotely. So Clara, what are some of your thoughts, on how that all intertwines?
Well, I think with the networking thing, that's really important. And as you all were talking, I was just thinking about, I had a couple of interns work for me over the years. Well, many interns. I still keep in contact with most of them, and they're all doing like really great things, and just being open to really being a mentor to people, I think is really important. Just to make sure that people know, like, hey, reach out to me, call me, just let me know if you need something. So yeah, most of the young folks that I'm mentoring now, it's been like a cold call, or they were interning for me. But yeah, there's a few people that have reached out and said, hey, I really like what you've done. Can you teach me how to do that? I'm like, yeah, the more the merrier. Let's figure this out. But yeah, I think in terms of just keeping that network alive, it's really important. And what was your question?
No, I think you answered it perfectly. I think the inner circle of the networks is so. And I loved how you talked about I still keep in touch with some of my interns, because it's fun to watch them grow over the years and be like, I have some that are tribal leaders now, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, you're doing so many cool things, and they're like, wow, and they're looking at you and they're like, oh, you've done some cool things too. And I'm like, yeah, well, we both done some cool things, and that's fun to have.
And cheerleading other people. Like, I feel like we get in our community this bad rap about, the crabs in a bucket thing, and it does exist, but more often than not, I feel like people really want to support other people. And certainly, I think when the Biden administration came into office, and there was this huge rallying support for then Congresswoman Holland, right? That was really cool to see our entire community pretty much come out and be like, yes, we want this person to be the Secretary of Interior.
Yeah.
Well, we're all connected. We all know somebody. Like, if we looked at our friends list on social media, we probably know a lot of the same people, right? Both of us, all of us.
Yeah.
Related to them, interrelated, through work, through all those networks. And so it doesn't take very long to have that connection anyway. Like, oh, you worked with my relative, or something like that.
Yeah. And, I know we've sort of ran around a little bit, but back on the advocacy piece, I mean, we have Sharice Davis, we have Tom Cole, both of those, amazing careers that they're having and have had, but also, again, representation is so important on the Hill, and I know both Sharice and Tom have specifically supported legislation for American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities, and it's critical, for those voices to be represented on the Hill, but also at a local level, and even all the way down. So we've talked a lot. We've talked about advocacy. We talked the importance of board membership. Now I want to talk about business, because you also run your presidency of your own company. Tell me a little bit about that journey, and how did that start?
Oh my gosh. Let's see. So 2013, right after I left the SBA pretty much, and I was running the Washington office, and I thought, well, trying to think about 10 steps ahead. What am I going to do after this? And I thought, I would like to run my own company. I was so inspired by all the entrepreneurs that I had been working with at the SBA. I thought, yeah, that's something I really want to do. So I filed paperwork, put my LLC in place, and then it just sort of sat there because I was busy doing other things, right? And then 2018 comes along, and I found myself in a position to say, okay, I can really focus on this now. Brought on a partner, and we just started hitting the ground running. So from 2013 to 2018, it just sort of sat there, collected dust, and I was gathering my thoughts, and like, how am I really going to do this? And then from 2018 till today, we've grown from employee number 1, myself, and then we went to 3 employees, and then 10. Now we're a little bit over 100 with a nationwide presence. So, I think it's been really exciting to be a part of, but also really, really scary. Yeah. Because I just thought at some point, okay, it's just going to be just me and maybe a few other people doing consulting. We might do these little contracts because we really started mostly in the IT space, and then doing professional technical management consulting, to now where it's really grown to be, those are still our primary industries, but it's grown to be much bigger than just a few of us.
And that's a pretty big growth in a short amount of time.
6 years, 100 staff.
Yeah.
So what are some of your and maybe you didn't have any, but were there any areas of that growth where you're like, oh, I should have backed up here, or maybe I grew too fast, or maybe I haven't grown fast enough? What's some of that?
It's funny because I think it depends on the day.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Like there are some days where I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so fast. How can I do this? When I feel that way, it's mostly in relation to cash flow, because when you grow really fast, and we were really super, excited to get this big contract out of Oklahoma with the MMAC, all of a sudden it was like 25 more employees overnight. Yeah. That's exciting, but you also have to realize, okay, I'm going to be covering payroll for 2 to 3 months before I get paid on this contract. Can I do that? So anytime I felt like that gut feeling of like this might be too fast has always been related less to the ability to grow, but more to the cash flow constraints. And then in other times I'm like, man, we should really be bigger by now. We should really be bigger. Why aren't we bigger? Why aren't we growing in this space or this space? So it just depends on from what lens I'm looking at it at.
And who did you have any support systems? I mean, of course, with your experience in the circles and everything that we've talked, but what really did you have a resource center or a friend or anything that says, hey, let me help you with this? Well,
I think bringing on the partner that I brought on was really critical. He's just amazing, and we knew each other from working in the government space. So we met actually at the SBA. He was outside working for an ANC at the time, and we just sort of stayed in contact. And then we both ended up working for the same company for a short period of time, and then we both left around the same time. So it just sort of became a natural, we should kind of work together. And you probably couldn't get 2 more different people than the 2 of us, which is so funny. I mean, whereas I'm very liberal, he's very conservative politically, right? We're our age difference is about 12 years age difference. We're just very different people. His kids are grown, he's from the American South. I've got a young family, but we've become such good friends and such good partners. And his experience working for the larger entities has been super invaluable. And then we brought on expertise pretty early on. We brought on a CFO who's just super fantastic. And it was really important to us to have, because, we have the government contracting, management sort of experience, but where we were lacking was this sort of CFO type of position. So I think knowing your weaknesses really early on and backfilling with people that have that expertise is really important.
That again resonates so much, because bringing on that right partner is so critical.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we meet people and you don't always have that good feeling about.
Right.
And that could be another company that you want to do business with. That could be, there's so having that balance is so critical.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the number one question that we always get with small business owners: how to scale up, access to capital. We have it at all of our Native Edge institutes. And so you've just now touched on that, the same exact thing that we hear over and over.
Scaling up.
Yeah.
It's so interesting because you do have to, that adage of you have to have money to make money, it is so true, because the first couple years of slow growth, I mean, it was literally money in and then watching it go right out the door, right? It's just, you're looking at your bank account kind of like, okay, how is it going to do this week, today? I mean, it's really that sort of, unless you have a big line of credit or something like that, you're really sort of living hand to mouth until something big comes along.
Mm-hmm. You know, all three of us balance family with business, and historically, I've had my kids are now going, or both of our, Yvette's kids are.
I have older children, younger children, grandchildren.
I have older children that are younger children. I feel like
soon to be young adults. You still have a couple teenagers at home,
scary.
though.
Yes, teenagers at home. One in college.
Yeah.
Clara, you have younger
I have
ones.
a 5 and a 6-year-old.
So how do you balance?
It's hard. I
Yeah.
mean, I really kind of push back against the narrative of you can have it all because, yeah, you can, but it really depends on the day to day. I mean, something has to give, right? I mean, a good example, last night, my youngest, my 5-year-old, sick all night long, just up and down sick all night long. He's just throwing up, not to get too graphic, but like it was a hard night, right? So it's like, well, what do I do in this situation? And I think it really comes down to support systems, like, having a spouse or a partner that can help lift that load. Rely really heavily on family. My mom is super integral into helping that, but you can't do it alone, and you certainly can't have it all. You can have one, maybe two great things on each given day, but it's about balancing that out, and so that the long haul, you're kind of going, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that work trip, or maybe I was gone too long in that case, but yeah, it's impossible to have it all.
Yeah, and I think that balance is so important, and not really. I think a lot, especially when my kids were young. I was on the road, a lot. And, I did have that support network, with my spouse. But, the times that I was home, I made sure that I really focused on that. And I think that's important too. That helped me keep sane a lot of times.
Totally.
I think all of us remember before BlackBerry and Apple phones and everything, you pretty much, once 5 o'clock hits, you don't really, you may take a computer home and do some email, but, we became a society all of a sudden that we went from having, 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 or whatever times that you work to always being on call.
Always being on.
And there is this importance of that because, the jobs that all of us have had, you need to be on call all the time. We're not doctors,
right?
Which that definitely you need to be on call all the time. Or Clara's probably a doctor.
No.
I didn't see that on
no,
LinkedIn.
it's not there.
It's coming. It's
coming. It's on page 7. But I think how technology has changed that a little bit, where the older I got, when I finally set that device down, was like, you know what? It's not an emergency at dinner time.
Right.
What are some of you guys' thoughts on that as technology has changed and influenced our careers and our small businesses and family life?
Yeah.
Well, I'm the elder here, so it was much different for me because there was no technology. And I had young kids. I was working full time, and then was a single parent at some point, and then added a child into my family mix when I met her at another community. And so if not that I had, nothing to do, I added a child.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but you do. You just have this work-life balance.
Twins.
And you do have to, they were a grade apart, my youngest son and then my daughter that I added. But there also was an age gap between my youngest, older 3 children, and then a 10-year gap, and then my son, and then I added a child. But like you said, the support system. So my father was my support system. And of course he was elderly, but just that I knew he was there with my kids when I'm still coming home or something, that meant the world to me. That they were safe. They were latchkey kids, really, but he always lived nearby, and so that was really helpful. But then going back to school, and it's like I have to complete my education and do all these things, and so you hear this over and over with anybody that you meet. That their work is so full, but yet they have that work family life balance, and how they juggle it. And so everybody's out there juggling a lot of different things. I see it now in my own children, and they want to have their children involved in things too. And so then there's that whole balance going on and everything. So I commend you, though, because you have done a lot in your resume and raised young children now. And it's just so wonderful and refreshing to see the change and the shift from when I was younger, seeing only a few people out there, gay kingmen and just different people. Her husband, who's long past, Tim Wapato, worked at the national, or start one of the board members of the National Center, and just the work that they've done, and they're still going.
Right.
I mean, gays getting honored in South Dakota. I just read this morning, the first female to be honored in the Hall of Fame in South Dakota in September. So we'll have to keep our eyes open for that. But it's just so refreshing. And so now you're a mentor to people.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened. It was like I was the young person. Now I'm like, you're asking me. I'm the grown up. You're asking me. Okay, let me think about that. Yeah. No, but I think that technology has changed so much, right?
Yeah.
And there is this pressure to be on all the time. And I think that you kind of have to draw the line yourself, because people will continue to take whatever they need. If you put yourself last, everybody's going to take whatever they need first. And I don't know, just making time for non-connected time. Like, even though we're more connected than we've ever been, I feel like we're more emotionally disconnected. It's amazing. You go to a restaurant and you see a family sitting there, and every single one of them are on a device, right? And we see that often, and it's like, well, I think there's that temptation to just sort of check out, but it's so critical just to put the devices away. That's been helpful. We've kind of made a shift in our own family life to do that. My husband's an attorney, so there's also this pressure for him to always be on as well. And none of us are doing brain surgery, so I think that's always a good reminder, like, we can turn it off and things can wait for a little bit.
Yeah. I have tried, and especially over the past decade, when I see my kids now going from 5-year-olds to 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds, and I'm like, man, do I need to have the device on all the time? Do I need to? So I definitely have made that shift in the past 10 years. Not that it has. Also, one of the things, and maybe you guys had this in your career, but when I was at Treasury, I felt like I needed to work 12, 15 hours a day, but I realized I might have been the first person to come in and the last person to leave, and I don't think anybody noticed.
Right.
I was still doing the work, but I was like, I just don't know some of those early days, and but I don't know if it was any value to me. Maybe it was, I don't know.
I don't know. I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
But I heard somewhere something, and I can't remember where I heard it, but I'll probably misquote it, but the general feeling, the sense was, your colleagues will not remember that you weren't able to attend that one meeting, but your kid will remember if you missed their t-ball game.
Yeah.
Right? And so kind of picking and choosing what are the most important things at that particular moment in time.
It has been quite a pleasure. One last thing, so we touched a little bit about this on some of with the Environmental Defense Fund and World Wildlife Fund. Can you talk about just some of your passion on environmental issues? I know that you consult on some environmental things. Talk a little bit about that before we finish up.
Yeah, for sure. So I joined the founding team of Navajo Power, where we were looking at, and none of these things exist in a vacuum. So we're talking about the advocacy work, the small business work, the mom work, all of those things. They all sort of interrelate, and I think Navajo Power is a really good example of all of that. I grew up on the Navajo Nation in Lupton, Arizona. In our community, most residents, when I was growing up, did not have running water or electricity, which is, very unfortunately really common for that time period on the nation, and still exists in many parts of the Navajo Nation. So we knew, and I knew from my policy work, that Navajo Generating Station was going to close. And I spent many years advocating for the continued operation of this dirty coal-fired power plant, which is not really mission or values aligned with how I feel as a person, but I'm looking at the 200 plus jobs, union jobs that are affiliated with this, and I'm looking at the 60% unemployment rate of Navajo. And I'm thinking, this plant closes down, the affiliated mine closes down. It's a win environmentally, but what is the plan long term for these people who will have no jobs? So that's always been in the back of my mind. Well, fast forward 6 years later, the mine's closing down. There has been no plans. There's been nothing done to ensure that there was a good transition for these individuals and for these employees, and it was really unfortunate. So myself, Brett Isaac, Dan Rosen, Josh Finn, we got together, and they all had very deep solar experience. I came to it from more of the policy and government experience, and we said, let's do something about this. Let's figure out how we can create some solar, use the transmission that's already going to be there, that's not going to be used, to bring some community benefits for the community. Because one of the risks in switching from non-renewables to renewables is that you repeat the same issues that happened in the past, where a company comes in, takes the resource, very little goes back to the local community, right? So we wanted to ensure that in solar and wind, whatever's happening, the people on the community side really are the ones that benefit the most. So we started that work 2018, 2019, we really start getting going. Now fast forward, we've got 750 megawatts under development on the western side of Navajo. So it'll be a very big solar field, but it's really been about educating people on, look, just because we're putting a solar field here, those 100 jobs aren't going to come back. We're talking a handful of jobs that come back. Construction is one thing, but once the construction's done, but then educating, how can we make sure that we're doing things that are responsible for the environment, but are also responsible and responsive to the community.
Yeah. And I think that, all three of us are from rural communities. I think that's so important, and it does tie into everything that we've said,
Right.
because you knew that was going to happen even years before it happened.
Right.
The story you told us, so having that awareness. But I think a lot of our communities need to start planning that way and diversifying, as you did, and so I think that's really great. Those. I think what people, and I mean, people in urban communities, they do understand because they have different challenges than you have in rural communities. But I want to sort of use the analogy, power is power, especially in areas where maybe had limited resources, limited power, so you're bringing that back. You also, it goes back to technology too, because historically, folks didn't have the ability to get internet in rural communities, and we've already sort of talk a little bit about how that's all holistic, and even how someone could even start a business at home now in a rural America that maybe 10, 15 years ago they couldn't do.
Oh yeah, we were talking earlier about Starlink, and so I have employees that are in very rural areas. Pandemic happened, and it was like, okay, you can't come into the office. What are we going to do? I was really, really proud of the fact that we didn't lay off one single person during the pandemic.
Oh, that's good.
Which was, for a small firm like us, really a big deal. We diversified into PPE, but we also made it possible for our rural folks to work from home. So putting Starlink in these really rural areas has been amazing. And then, talking to employees, will be on Zoom, and somebody will have a sheep or a chicken kind of walking in the background. But it's really about, building infrastructure that meets the needs of people versus meeting the needs of business. And that's been really important. Infrastructure in general in a lot of our rural areas, super lacking. And I think we have the additional challenge in our tribal communities where there's actually a resistance to building infrastructure. So some of the projects we worked on have had outright resistance from some folks saying, we don't want it, we don't trust it, because there is institutional trauma. There is all these things, really legitimate things, like we don't want a company coming in and taking something and telling us what to do. We'd rather go without than have something that could be harmful, which I totally get. So I think that's why it's really important to have entities like ours, Navajo Power, to come in and dialogue that in a way that makes sense to people. I mean, it's not like you have instant credibility and trust just because you're Navajo or because you're tribal. In fact, sometimes that works against you. Like,
sometimes when you go away and you come back, then
they're like, what are you trying to do? You think you're too good.
You came back?
You came back, So I think there's those challenges too, but it's all related because you get you get the basic infrastructure, and I think basic infrastructure covers internet nowadays, right? That's a basic need. You get water, you get power, and you get basic infrastructure to people. You give them an opportunity to succeed. They can start a business. Yeah. They can have access to the outside world. Whereas, growing up, I could see a truck maybe about 10 miles away, and I was like, ooh, there's people over there,
right.
Because we were so rural.
Yeah. Like we had long distance phone calls. 30
we didn't even have a phone. You guys were like,
ooh.
You guys were fancy.
My mother had binoculars.
We had binoculars.
Yeah, we had a phone. But to call some of my friends, it cost like 25 cents a minute, which in the 80s and 90s, that was a good phone. I would remember when my dad would get the bills sometimes. He's like, what are you doing? Talking to these
Get off
people.
that phone.
Who are you talking to for 45 minutes?
We had the long cord.
I was just thinking the other day how, we didn't have phone, and I remember my first boyfriend in high school, and I was so excited to drive to the post office because there might be a letter from him.
Oh.
I know. And then to talk, we'd have to drive to the truck stop or the chapter house and use the payphone. That's how. Now we're so spoiled. I was on the phone with my mom in the parking lot earlier, walking her through how to download an app. It's like, this is amazing.
I just sent a postcard the other day. I haven't sent
that?
a postcard in 100 years.
Yeah.
And I did. I sent a postcard.
I think that's a good value because I send Christmas cards and I try to write in every card, at least something. I try.
You send the best Christmas cards.
Oh, thank you.
Best Christmas cards.
But I think there's that penmanship, that writing a letter is something that we have lost. So I do think that, that's going to be my commitment. My commitment today on the Native
some of those
Edge
skills
is to write
they're needed.
I'm going to write letters to people.
Should.
Just
I didn't realize
it's a surprise.
that young people can't read cursive.
What would you tell a younger version of yourself?
Ooh.
Oh my gosh, that's a tough one. I'd probably say, I don't know. Gosh, what would I say?
I wasn't
Just
asked the question.
Take the risks. Don't be scared. Take the risks.
That's so true. And I have found that, and I've said that before, that a lot of our small business owners, they were willing to take that risk.
You have to have the stomach for it, I think. It's tough.
And it's okay to get out of your shell. Yes. I think that was one of the things I in my mind, and I don't know how I got this into my mind, but it was like, okay, you go to college and then you go back home and work, in your community. Or, for me, I was working for my dad at the restaurants on the reservation. Yeah. That was sort of my path. And that was like all I knew. And I don't ever regret that decision. But there was no why don't you take some time and go to Iceland? That was not an option. It was like, okay, you go to college, you keep working. You just go. I worked through college, so that was sort of the idea. And it took me until I was close to 30 before I could really break. I was like in Cherokee, North Carolina. I was like, I will never leave here. I'm never going to leave the mountains of North Carolina. This is my home. This is where I'm going to be. I'm going to support my community. I'm going to work for my dad, whatever it is. And that was my thinking all my life. And it up until about 30, when someone did give me the idea of you could go work in Washington, D.C. That was just like a pipe dream. But once I did it, then it was like it almost grew. Yeah.
Really inspired you.
It did inspire me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it looked beyond those boundaries.
And the advice that one of my mentors gave me, who unfortunately has passed on, but her name was Jan Walkingstick. She actually said to me, when you lose your roots, you need to come back home. Mm-hmm. And that was something why it was so important for me to be here at the National Center, because I did feel like this was a little bit of a homecoming, because I had done a lot of the different things, and then working here and working in our communities every day is so important to me. It is. And it is in my blood, and in my whole DNA is working for our communities, and that's why I wanted to be here. That's a big part of why I'm here.
Coming home, I think.
Coming home to Arizona. And Clara was like, oh, you should come to Arizona sometime. That was years ago.
That was years ago. And I kept saying, let's go to, come to Arizona.
Yeah, come to Arizona. You should come to Arizona. You just need some time. Just get out in the desert and just, because I was always with the both of you, but a lot of times I'm always talking about, well, what am I going to do next in life? And you're like, come on. You're like 50 years old. What are you going to do next in life? Which is fine. Yeah. But that was one of your advices. Clara told me one time, I don't know, one of the transitions in my life, she's like, oh, just go out and hang out in the desert.
Hang out in the desert,
Figured
man.
it
And
out.
now you live in the desert.
I know.
You live
I'm
in the
hanging out in the
desert.
desert all the time. Yeah.
I never in a million years thought that you would move out here, but I'm so glad you did.
I think, I think 90% of anybody
Questioned
around me
it probably in the
questioned it,
early days.
What are you moving out there for? Well, I will say, and I think that's, again, getting out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
It was a big move. I mean, you too. I mean, you were in D.C. I mean, even though home was here in this area, but you had been in D.C. for decades.
Years,
a decade.
Yeah.
It's always good to go home, though.
Yeah.
What's the word? Reinvigorated. How do you say it?
I love that. I like how you make up words.
I know, I do. Rejuvenated.
Rejuvenated. There it is. I like
Rejuvenated.
Yvette's
But no, the
made-up
other one.
word.
Reconnected, and
Reinvigorated.
You get
reinvigorated.
Yeah.
Is that the word?
Say it again.
Reinvigorated?
Reinvigorated.
There you go.
Yes.
Yay.
Got a winner.
Ding ding.
Yeah. Well, I think so. Clara, thank you so much for today and all your time. I think it's been wonderful to know you all of these years and always have you as one of my dearest friends, where even when we don't talk for maybe a month or 2 months at a time, it's always a text or like, hey, how's it going?
Emoji.
Or like, oh, we need to catch up.
Like a cup of coffee emoji, and you're like, oh yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's so important to have those friends like that, and how our careers have intertwined so many times, and so it's a pleasure just to sit and talk.
It is
about publicly.
Publicly, yes.
Yes.
For
everybody to know.
Pretty much what we would talk about normally.
Yeah, this is exactly what we would have talked about, like if we had coffee. So I think that's really important. So I am so happy to have seen all the awesome things you do, and I'm very genuine to say you are a true leader in our communities, and it's so important I just can't wait to see what you do next.